The 9th report was filed on a Thursday morning in October. By Friday it was gone. Not archived, not transferred to a different department, not flagged for review, or moved to a restricted folder that I could request access to through proper channels. Gone. Completely removed from the system as if it had never existed. No record of submission, no record of deletion. Nothing in the audit trail that every filed report is supposed to generate automatically when it enters the Michigan DNR database. Just an empty space where a document had been 24 hours earlier, and a supervisor who would not meet my eyes when I asked him about it directly across his desk on that Friday afternoon. That was the 9th time in 16 years. I had kept copies of all 9. Starting from the 3rd one, when I understood that the disappearances were not a system error and not a coincidence, and not something that was going to stop happening if I waited long enough for someone to fix it. I kept physical copies, printed on paper, stored in a fireproof lockbox in my home that my supervisor did not know about, and that my wife knew exactly where to find if something happened to me. 9 reports documenting 9 encounters across 16 years of patrol work in the forests of northern Michigan. 9 times I wrote down exactly what I saw, and submitted it through official channels and watched it vanish within 24 hours. I am telling you about all 9 now. Not because I think it will change anything about what was suppressed. 16 years is a long time, and the people who made those reports disappear have had 16 years to make sure the disappearances are permanent. I am telling you because I spent 16 years doing a job that required me to document what I observed in the field with precision and integrity. And 9 times someone decided that precision and integrity were less important than keeping a particular set of facts out of the official record of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. I owe the truth of those 9 encounters to the record that someone else decided I was not allowed to create. I served 6 years in the Army before I joined the DNR infantry. 2 deployments. The Army taught me to be a careful observer in difficult terrain and to write accurate field reports under circumstances that made accuracy difficult, and to understand that the integrity of a report is the integrity of the person who wrote it and cannot be separated from it. When someone pulls your report the day after you file it, they are not just removing a document. They are telling you that what you observed does not exist, that what you wrote down did not happen, that your integrity as an observer and a recorder of facts is subject to revision by whoever holds the delete key. I am 61 years old. I retired from the DNR 14 months ago after 22 years of service. I kept my mouth shut for most of those 22 years because I valued my job and my pension and the practical ability to keep doing work I believed in. I am done keeping my mouth shut. The important thing is what I saw in the forests of northern Michigan across 16 years of patrol work and what happened every single time I tried to put it on the official record. Here is all of it. Starting with the first report. The summer before the first encounter, I had been transferred from my previous post in the Lower Peninsula to a district in the Upper Peninsula that covers a large section of old-growth forest bordering Lake Superior. The transfer was a promotion in practical terms. More territory, more responsibility. Work that required genuine expertise in wilderness assessment and wildlife management, rather than the more routine patrol work I had been doing in the southern districts. The Upper Peninsula is a different place from the Lower Peninsula in ways that go beyond geography. The old-growth sections of forest up there, the stands of timber that survived the logging era of the late 1800s and have been growing without significant interruption since before European settlement, those forests have a quality that I noticed within the first week of patrol work and never fully adjusted to. A quality of depth. Not just physical depth, though the forest is genuinely vast in those sections. Something more than physical depth. A quality of being inside something that has its own awareness and its own rules, and that does not particularly require your acknowledgement or your comfort to keep operating the way it operates. I grew up in a hunting family in rural Michigan. I've been in forests my entire life. I know the difference between a forest that feels inhabited and a forest that feels watched. The old-growth sections of my patrol district felt watched in a way that was specific and consistent, and that every experienced officer I worked with in that district had noticed, and none of them talked about directly. I had been in the district for 8 months when the first encounter happened. I want to tell you what those first 8 months in the district were like before the first encounter, because the context matters for understanding how the encounter registered when it finally happened. The Upper Peninsula is not a place that gives itself to you quickly. The Lower Peninsula, where I had spent my previous years with the DNR, is a workable landscape, manageable terrain, familiar wildlife patterns, the kind of forest that has been in active relationship with human activity long enough that both sides have developed a working understanding of each other. The Upper Peninsula old growth is different in a way I noticed immediately, and that every experienced officer in the district communicated through behavior rather than words. The way they moved in that forest. The particular quality of attention they maintained in certain sections. The things they did not say when a new officer asked the questions a new officer asks. I asked one of the senior officers in my second month, a woman who had been in the district for over 20 years, whether there was anything about the territory I should know that was not in the training materials. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said that the old growth sections required a different kind of patience than the managed forest sections. She said that in the managed forest you were always the most aware thing in the environment. She said in the old growth that was not always true, and that the best thing you could do with that knowledge was to keep your observations accurate and your reports precise, and not jump to conclusions that your evidence did not fully support. I understood what she was telling me about 3 years later, when I had enough of my own encounters to read what she had said properly. She was telling me she had seen things in those forests, that the institutional practice was not to discuss them directly, and that the best framework she could offer a new officer for navigating the territory was to maintain the integrity of your own observation without relying on the institution to validate what you found. That was good advice. I wish I had understood it earlier. The cold that comes to the Upper Peninsula in late October carries genuine winter in it. Not the suggestion of winter, but the actual thing. Temperatures dropping into the 20s overnight with wind off the lake that makes the real temperature feel considerably lower. It was late October of my first year in the district when the first encounter happened. Not the suggestion of winter, but the actual thing. Temperatures dropping into the 20s overnight with wind off the lake that makes the real temperature feel considerably lower. I was on foot patrol in a section of old-growth forest about 12 miles from the nearest road, following a creek bed that had been showing signs of unusual animal activity for several weeks. Not predator activity, not the kind of disturbance that suggested a population problem or a disease issue. Something else. Disturbances that did not match the behavioral signature of any animal in my training or experience. I found the first sign at around 3 in the afternoon, a series of depressions in the soft ground along the creek bank that I initially processed as tracks before my training caught up with what I was actually looking at. The impression was bipedal, single file, the way a person walks rather than the alternating pattern of quadrupedal movement. The stride length was wrong for a person, too long by a significant margin, and the depth of the impression was wrong for any person I could imagine, suggesting a weight distribution that far exceeded the human range. I measured the impressions with the equipment I carried for exactly that kind of field assessment. I photographed them. I noted the stride length and the depth and the specific characteristics of the toe impressions, which were not the rounded toe impressions of a boot but individual digit impressions with a spacing and depth that suggested significant physical strength in the forefoot. I followed the trail for approximately 400 yards along the creek bank before I stopped following it. I stopped because the trail ended at a section of the creek bank where the soft ground transitioned to exposed limestone, and because at the point where the trail ended, there was something else. A smell that I want to describe as accurately as I can, because accuracy matters here. It was not an animal smell in the ordinary sense, not the musk of a deer or the territorial marking of a predator or the smell of decay that indicates a kill site. It was something more complex than any of those. Forest floor and something organic underneath it, and something else that I have no name for, something that registered in my nervous system before it registered in my conscious mind as a signal that I was in the presence of something I had not been trained to encounter. I stood at the end of that trail on the exposed limestone bank of that creek for a long time. Then I walked back to my vehicle, and I drove to the district office and I wrote the first report. I submitted it the following morning. By the afternoon of the day after submission, it was gone from the system. I asked my supervisor about it. He told me it had been removed due to a data entry error and that I should resubmit with the correct form numbers. I resubmitted. The resubmission was also gone by the following morning. My supervisor told me the server had experienced a migration issue and that some recently filed documents had been affected. He told me it was a technical problem and that it would be resolved. I was new to the district. I had 8 months of experience in this specific territory. I accepted the explanation and I moved on. I did not yet understand what I was dealing with. Snowmelt had softened the ground across the district, and the creek beds were running high when I found the tracks again the following spring. Different location, same district, a section of old growth approximately 6 miles from the creek bed where I had found them the previous October. Same bipedal impression pattern. Same anomalous stride length. Same depth suggesting a weight distribution outside the human range. This time the trail was longer, nearly 3/4 of a mile, and at one point it crossed a section of soft forest floor where the impressions were particularly clear, and where I could see something that the October tracks had not shown me. The impressions were not uniform. They varied in a way that indicated the thing making them was moving with intention rather than at a consistent pace. Some impressions were deeper at the heel, suggesting a moment of stopping or turning. Some showed a wider stance than the standard stride, suggesting a moment of stability being sought on uneven ground. Whatever was making these tracks was not walking through the forest on autopilot. It was navigating. It was paying attention to the terrain in the specific way that you pay attention to terrain when you are moving through it with a purpose. I filed the second report. It was gone within 24 hours. This time, I did not ask my supervisor about it. I went back to my vehicle and I wrote down everything I had observed in a personal notebook I kept in my jacket pocket. The same habit I had developed in the Army for recording observations that might not make it into an official report before conditions changed. Then I drove home, and I printed a copy of the report from my personal records before it was pulled from the system, because by the time of the second disappearance, I had started keeping personal backups of everything I filed. The third encounter was 6 weeks after the second, late spring, low light at the end of a long patrol day, and I was moving through a section of old growth that I had not patrolled extensively before, a dense stand of hemlock and cedar that the district map showed as essentially trackless. I was checking a report of unusual predator activity from a hunting camp on the district's eastern boundary, and I had gone deeper into the hemlock stand than I intended, before I realized the light was going faster than I had accounted for. I heard it before I saw it, a vocalization from my left, approximately 50 yards into the trees. Not a sound I could immediately identify from my wildlife training or my Army experience or my entire life of being in forests. It had structure to it, deliberateness. The quality of a sound made with intention rather than the reflexive vocalization of an animal responding to a stimulus. It was loud enough that the volume alone told me the source was substantially larger than any animal that would vocalize that way in that habitat. Wolves do not sound like that. Bears do not sound like that. Nothing in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that my training covered sounds like that. I stopped moving. I controlled my breathing the way the Army taught me to control breathing in situations that required clear perception over reactive response. I turned slowly toward the direction of the sound, and I scanned the hemlock stand with the methodical attention of someone who has been trained to see things in difficult terrain. I saw it for approximately 8 seconds. Standing between two hemlock trunks at a distance I estimated at 40 yards. Upright on 2 legs with a posture that combined the physical scale of something that should not have been standing that way, with a quality of absolute stillness that suggested it had been standing there watching me for longer than 8 seconds. The head was canine in profile. Long snout. Ears set high on the skull. The body was enormous across the shoulders and narrow at the waist in a way that looked almost architectural, as if the proportions had been designed for a specific purpose rather than evolved through ordinary biological processes. The fur was dark, appearing almost black in the low light of the hemlock stand. It looked at me. I want to be clear about the quality of that looking. It was not the way a startled animal looks at a human, the wide reflexive eye that registers threat and calculates escape. It was assessment. The specific quality of being assessed by something that is deciding what you are and what you represent and what it is going to do about your presence. The quality of intelligence behind that assessment was what I could not reconcile with anything in my training. I have been assessed by hostile actors in 2 combat deployments, and I know what assessed looks like from the inside. What looked at me from between those hemlock trunks was assessing me. Then it moved into the deeper forest without a sound I could detect, and it was gone. I wrote the 3rd report that evening. I submitted it the following morning. By the following afternoon it was gone. This time I went home and I bought a fireproof lockbox. I want to describe the physical characteristics of the watcher across the full 16 years because those characteristics are part of the documented record, and they belong here even though they are the part of the account that will attract the most skepticism. The size was consistent across all 9 encounters. Bipedal, standing upright. Estimated height between 8 and 9 feet based on comparisons against known reference points in the field, trees and rock formations, and my own height, that I used to calibrate visual estimates. The weight I could only infer from the track impressions and from the quality of its movement, the specific way very heavy things move through terrain that requires them to pay attention to the ground beneath them. My estimate, based on track depth measurements across multiple encounters and the behavioral patterns of movement, was somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds. I want to be clear that those are estimates developed from field observation rather than measurement, and that I hold them with the appropriate uncertainty. The fur was dark across all encounters, appearing near black in low light conditions, and showing deep brown undertones in direct light when the later encounters provided sufficient proximity to observe that level of detail. The canine head structure was consistent and unmistakable across all encounters. Long snout, high-set ears, a bone structure that registered in my observation as dog-like before I had consciously processed what I was looking at, which is the specific quality of a perception that has bypassed the analytical layer and landed directly in the pattern recognition system. The body structure was bipedal in a way that was not the bipedal movement of a bear rearing or a primate moving upright. It was bipedal in the way that a thing is bipedal when 2-legged movement is its natural state, rather than an adaptation of a primarily 4-legged structure. The second creature, the one I came to call the restless one, was larger across the shoulders than the watcher and lighter in fur color. A brown that was clearly distinct from the watcher's near black, even at the distances at which I typically observed it. Its movement quality was consistently different from the watcher's across all observations, faster and less patient, and with a quality of physical energy that the watcher never displayed. Where the watcher moved as if it had already decided where it was going and was simply traveling there, the restless one moved as if it was making decisions about direction and speed in real time, reacting rather than executing a predetermined pattern. I never observed the restless one at close range. The farthest I ever saw the watcher was the first encounter at my estimated 40 yards. The restless one was never closer than approximately 70 yards in any of the observations where I could see it clearly enough to take notes. Whether that distance was a behavioral choice of the restless one or a product of the circumstances of those specific observations, I cannot say with certainty. I need to tell you about something I first observed during the fourth encounter, and that remained a consistent element of every subsequent encounter across the remaining 12 years, because it is essential to the full account, and because leaving it out would mean leaving out something that the 9 reports all documented, and that whoever pulled those reports apparently found as significant as the primary encounters themselves. There were 2 of them. Not always visible simultaneously, not always audible simultaneously, but present simultaneously in a way that I became increasingly able to read as my encounters accumulated and my understanding of the behavioral patterns developed. The creature I have described in the first 3 encounters, the one that stood still and assessed me and moved with that deliberate, controlled quality, I came to think of as the watcher. Because watching was its consistent mode. It appeared, it assessed, it held its position with patience and stillness, and it disappeared without aggression or display. The second creature was different in almost every quality except size. Where the watcher was still, the second creature was restless. Where the watcher's movements were controlled and deliberate, the second creatures were faster and less patient. Where the watcher seemed to operate according to a set of internal rules it held consistently, the second creature seemed to operate at the edge of whatever rules governed the watcher, pushing against them, testing them, present in the encounters in a way that was less purposeful and more reactive. I first detected the second creature during the 4th encounter in the summer of my 4th year in the district. I was on foot in a section of old growth near the district's northern boundary when the watcher appeared at the usual distance and in the usual posture of patient assessment. I had been through 3 encounters by then, and I had developed the ability to hold my position and my breathing when the watcher appeared rather than triggering the full threat response that the first encounter had produced. I was watching the watcher and the watcher was watching me, and the encounter was following the pattern I had come to recognize. Then I heard something to my right. Deeper in the forest, farther from my position than the watcher, moving through the undergrowth with a quality of movement that was faster and less careful than anything the watcher had ever produced. A sound of size and intention, but without the patience, without the control. The watcher heard it too. I could see the response in the slight reorientation of its head, the shift of attention from me to whatever was moving in the forest to my right, before it returned its attention to me with that same steady assessment. The sound from the forest to my right continued for several minutes and then stopped. The watcher held its position through all of it, watching me, apparently undisturbed by whatever was moving in the trees to my right, in a way that suggested it knew what was moving there, and had already made whatever assessment it needed to make about the situation. Then both of them were gone, not simultaneously. The watcher first, moving into the deeper forest with its characteristic silence, then the sound from the right diminishing and stopping. and I was alone in the old growth with my field notebook open and my hand not entirely steady on the pen. The fourth report documented both presences. It was gone within 24 hours. 7 years in the district had given me a clear enough picture of the suppression pattern, and the fifth report confirmed it beyond any remaining doubt. Of the suppression pattern to understand that I was not dealing with technical errors or data migration issues or any of the explanations my supervisor had offered in the early years. I was dealing with a deliberate and consistent policy of removal that operated with a speed and completeness that required either system-level access or direct supervisory authority over the database. I had tested the system carefully across the years between the third and fifth reports. I had filed other reports on other subjects and tracked their progress through the database. Those reports remained. They generated the expected audit trail. They were archived according to standard procedure and remained accessible through standard search functions for as long as I checked. The pattern of disappearance was specific to the 9 encounters. Nothing else I filed was ever touched. That specificity told me something important. Whoever was pulling the reports was not performing a broad suppression of my filed work. They were monitoring for specific content and removing only the reports that contained it. They knew what to look for, they knew when to act, and they acted within 24 hours every single time across 16 years, which meant the monitoring was active and consistent and had not been discontinued at any point across the full span of my career in the district. I want to be careful here about what I am claiming and what I am not claiming. I am not claiming I know who pulled the reports. I have a theory, which I will tell you, but a theory developed by a single observer without access to the administrative records of a state agency is not the same as documented fact. What I am claiming is documented fact is this: 9 reports were filed. 9 reports disappeared within 24 hours of filing. The disappearances followed a consistent pattern that excluded technical error as an explanation. The content of the disappeared reports was specific to a single category of observation, and the speed and consistency of the disappearances across 16 years required someone with both the access and the motivation to monitor and remove that specific category of report on an ongoing basis. Those are the facts I can establish from what I personally observed and documented across 16 years. Everything beyond that is inference, and I want to be honest about where the facts end and the inference begins. My theory is this: the Michigan DNR has a long institutional history in the Upper Peninsula. Officers who worked that territory for decades before my assignment there. A body of institutional knowledge about what exists in those forests that is not in any training manual and is not transmitted through official channels. A quiet understanding, passed from experienced officers to new ones through implication rather than direct statement, that certain observations are not to be documented in ways that create official records requiring official responses. I believe someone in the administrative structure of the DNR above my supervisor's level made a decision at some point, possibly long before my assignment to the district, that reports of the kind I was filing created more institutional problems than they solved. That acknowledging the existence of what I was encountering in those forests would require the department to take positions it was not prepared to take and answer questions it was not prepared to answer. And that the simplest solution to that institutional problem was to ensure that the reports did not exist. I believe that is why every single one of my 9 reports was gone within 24 hours of filing. I cannot prove it, but I believe it. The encounters continued across the following years with a regularity that ceased to surprise me and began instead to feel like a feature of the territory. The Upper Peninsula forests were the Watcher's home. I was a visitor in that home who'd been assessed and found acceptable enough to observe. That was the understanding I developed across the middle years of my 16-year span, and it was an understanding that shaped how I conducted patrol work in the district in ways I never documented officially, and could not have documented officially without creating exactly the kind of report that was going to disappear the next day. Snow had been on the ground for 3 weeks without a thaw, that particular settled winter that the Upper Peninsula produces in the deep months. I was on winter patrol in a section of old growth in my 8th year when the 5th encounter happened. That received heavy snowfall that year, the kind of snow that settles into the hemlock and cedar branches and creates a specific quality of silence in the forest that is different from any other silence. I was checking trail conditions on snowshoe, and the watcher appeared at the usual distance in the usual posture, and we held our positions and our assessment of each other for approximately 6 minutes before it moved away. What was different about the 5th encounter was the snow. The watcher left tracks, bipedal, the same stride length and depth I had documented in the earlier encounters, clear in the fresh snow in a way that the soft forest floor of the warmer months never produced. I followed those tracks for approximately 1 mile before they ended at a rocky outcropping where the snow cover was too thin to hold impressions. I photographed every foot of that trail. I measured every impression. I documented every variation in the stride and depth and spacing that told me about the creature's movement patterns and weight distribution and the specific way it navigated terrain. The 5th report was the most detailed of all 9. I had a mile of bipedal tracks in fresh snow and 2 years of accumulated observational data to draw on. I was thorough, and I was precise, and I filed it with the confidence of someone who has documented something real and documented it well. It was gone within 24 hours. I am not going to pretend that did not affect me. I had been a careful officer for most of my career, the kind of person who takes integrity in documentation seriously, because the Army taught me to take it seriously and because the work requires it. Watching a thorough and honest report disappear for the 5th time in 8 years produced something in me that I want to name accurately, which was not discouragement. It was something closer to resolve. A decision that if the official record was going to be emptied of these encounters regardless of what I filed, then the unofficial record I kept in the lockbox at home was going to be complete enough and detailed enough to stand on its own. I became a better observer after the 5th disappearance, not because the standard dropped, but because I understood that the only record that was going to survive was the one I protected myself. The undergrowth was thick and green that summer, the kind of dense growth that comes after a wet spring in old-growth forest. 4 years after the 5th encounter, in the same district section, I was checking a boundary trail when the 6th happened, and it added something new. The watcher appeared at the usual distance and in the usual posture, but this time it was carrying something. Not the way the tracks and the observations had suggested it might carry things. Something specific and deliberate. A branch, roughly the length and diameter of a forearm, stripped of its bark and held in one hand at its side in a way that was not threatening, but was also not casual. It was the first time across 6 encounters that I had observed the watcher carrying anything, and the deliberateness of the carrying, the way it held the branch with a specific grip rather than simply dragging it, registered as significant in a way I could not immediately parse. It held the branch throughout the encounter, and it held it when it moved away into the forest. I do not know what the branch was for. I included the observation in the 6th report with the honest notation that I could not determine its significance. The 6th report disappeared within 24 hours, like all the others. I want to mention something here that I did not include in the 6th report, because I was not certain enough of its significance at the time, and because I had learned by then to be careful about what I committed to official documentation when that documentation was going to disappear the next day anyway. During that 6th encounter, after the watcher had moved away, and I was making my field notes at the location where I had been standing, I found a small flat stone at the base of a hemlock approximately 10 yards from my position. Dark gray, roughly palm-sized. It had marks on the surface that I initially assumed were natural fracture lines. I turned it over twice, noted it in my personal notebook as something to check on a return visit, and left it where it was. When I returned to that section 2 weeks later, the stone was gone. I thought about it occasionally across the following years without arriving at any conclusion I was confident enough to commit to paper. At the time, I logged it as an incidental observation of uncertain significance. I understand now, looking back from the other side of the 9th encounter and the carved stone that sits on my kitchen windowsill, that it was the first indication the relationship was not running only in my direction. That something was paying the same quality of attention to my presence in that forest that I was paying to its. Rain had been moving through the district for a week, and the old growth had that particular quality of wet forest sound, every surface carrying moisture, every movement amplified. It was during that stretch of wet weather that the 7th encounter happened, the first time I observed both creatures simultaneously in a way I could clearly perceive as simultaneous. In a way that I could clearly perceive as simultaneous presence rather than sequential. I was in a section of old growth near the district's western boundary when the watcher appeared to my north at the usual distance. I held my position. The watcher held its position. And then from the east, from a direction approximately 90 degrees from the watcher's position, the second creature moved through the undergrowth in a way that was loud enough to be clearly audible and fast enough to be clearly not the watcher. It appeared at the tree line to my east for approximately 3 seconds before it moved back into the forest. In those 3 seconds, I got the clearest look at the second creature I had ever had, larger than the watcher across the shoulders. The fur was lighter in color, a deep brown rather than the near black of the watcher. The movement was different. The restless quality I had been detecting through sound for years translated into visible motion that confirmed what I had inferred. Less controlled, more reactive. The kind of physical presence that keeps one part of your threat assessment running even when the threat assessment has not formally triggered. The watcher did not look at the second creature during those 3 seconds. It kept its eyes on me. Whatever the second creature's appearance represented in the logic of the encounter, the watcher had apparently already accounted for it. The 7th report documented both presences in detail. It was gone within 24 hours. The encounters across the middle years built something in me I want to describe honestly, because it is part of the account of what 16 years of this kind of observation does to a person. I became, across those years, a different kind of observer in that forest than I had been when I arrived. Not different in the technical skills. The Army gave me those, and 16 years of field work maintained them. Different in what I was observing for. When I first came to the district, I was observing for what I had been trained to observe. Wildlife population health, environmental disturbance indicators, evidence of illegal activity. The standard categories of DNR patrol work in a large wilderness district. By my 10th year, I was observing for something additional to all of those. I was paying attention to a specific quality of presence in certain sections of the old growth that I had learned to read across 9 years of encounters. Not the creature itself, the quality of the territory the creature inhabited, the specific sections of forest where the air had that particular weight and density I had first noticed at the creek bank on the day of the first encounter, where the wildlife patterns showed a subtle but consistent variation from the surrounding forest that suggested the presence of a significant predator the wildlife was accounting for and that I could never identify through conventional observation. I became, in other words, a better reader of the territory the watcher inhabited, because I had been in that territory long enough to understand something of how the territory worked when it was fully itself. when the managed boundaries in the institutional categories fell away, and what was left was the old growth forest doing what old growth forests do across a span of time that exceeds any human institutional memory. That understanding is what I brought to the 8th and 9th encounters. The reason the 8th encounter's reduced distance registered as significant is that I had spent 9 years learning to read the significance of small variations in established patterns. The reason the 9th encounter's one step felt like an arrival rather than a threat is that 16 years of paying careful attention to something had built a quality of mutual recognition between me and what I was paying attention to. You cannot get that from reports. You can only get it from the 16 years. I want to tell you something that is mildly embarrassing, but that I think adds an honest quality to this account that pure gravity would not. In the 10th year of my time in the district, after 7 encounters and 7 disappeared reports, and several years of keeping detailed personal records in the lockbox at home, my wife suggested that I try to find other people who had documented similar encounters in the Upper Peninsula. She suggested I look online. I am not a person who spends significant time on the Internet. The Army did not prepare me for the Internet, and the DNR did not require it, and I had managed my entire adult life without developing any particular fluency with it. I spent an evening trying to search for relevant accounts and ended up on a series of websites that I found deeply unhelpful. Not because the accounts were implausible, but because the way they were presented required me to navigate so many flashing advertisements and autoplay videos and comment sections full of people arguing with each other that I gave up after approximately 40 minutes and went to sit on the porch instead. My wife found the relevant material in about 10 minutes the following morning and showed me 3 accounts from Upper Peninsula hunters that matched the behavioral patterns I had been documenting for a decade. I asked her how she found them so quickly. She said she used the search bar and typed what she was looking for. I told her that was what I had done. She did not say anything further, but her expression suggested she had a view on the matter that she was choosing not to share. I have since improved my search capabilities. Marginally. I have thought a great deal since my retirement about what the suppression of those 9 reports actually accomplished and what it failed to accomplish. What it accomplished is clear enough. There is no official record in the Michigan DNR database of what I encountered in those forests across 16 years. No documentation that a DNR officer in the Upper Peninsula District observed and recorded evidence of something that does not fit the established categories of wildlife management or environmental science. No institutional acknowledgement that the 9 reports were ever filed, let alone that they were removed. From the perspective of the official record, the 16 years of encounters did not happen. What the suppression failed to accomplish is also clear. It did not remove the encounters from the memory of the person who had them. It did not remove the 9 reports from the fireproof lockbox, or the carved stone from the kitchen windowsill, or the 2 words from wherever they live in a person after something says them to you in a hemlock forest in October. It did not prevent the encounters from shaping how I understood the territory I worked in across 16 years, and it did not prevent me from sitting down 14 months after retirement and putting all of it into an account that exists now outside any system that can pull it the next day. I also think about what the suppression tells us about what the institution knows, because a policy of consistent, active, 24-hour removal of reports in a specific category across 16 years is not a policy that gets established and maintained in the absence of institutional knowledge about what the reports contain. Someone created that policy. Someone maintained it. Someone monitored my filed work for 16 consecutive years and took action within 24 hours every single time a report of a specific kind appeared. That level of institutional commitment to suppression requires institutional understanding of what is being suppressed and why it matters. The Michigan DNR knows something about what lives in those Upper Peninsula forests. The policy of removing reports like mine is itself evidence of that knowledge. You do not build a 16-year suppression apparatus around something you do not believe exists. You build it around something you very much believe exists and have decided the official record is better without. I find that both troubling and, in an odd way, reassuring. Troubling for the obvious reasons. Reassuring because it means I am not the only person who knows. Somewhere, in the institutional memory of the Michigan DNR, there is an acknowledgement, never documented, never discussable in official channels, never permitted to enter the record, that what I was documenting in those forests across 16 years is real. The light in the Upper Peninsula in late September has a specific quality, a clarity that the summer months never produce. Every detail of the old growth rendered in a particular sharpness. That specific quality of light was what I was moving through in my 14th year in the district when the 8th encounter happened, and something shifted in a way I want to describe carefully, because it is the encounter that changed my understanding of the full 16-year span in a way that nothing before it had. Late September of my 14th year in the district carries a specific clarity in the Upper Peninsula old growth. The light drops at a particular angle through the hemlock canopy that turns the forest floor copper in the late afternoon. I was moving through that light when the 8th encounter happened, the kind of clear, cold afternoon that the Upper Peninsula produces in autumn with a quality of light that makes the old growth look older than it usually does. I was deep in a section of hemlock forest I had patrolled many times across 14 years when the watcher appeared at the usual distance. What was different was the distance. It appeared closer than any previous encounter. Not dramatically closer. Perhaps 10 yards less than its established range. But in 14 years of encounters, the watcher had maintained a consistent distance from me, with the same kind of absolute behavioral consistency that I had observed in its other patterns, and a 10-yard variation in that consistency registered as significant in the same way that any deviation from an established pattern registers as significant to someone trained to read patterns. I held my position. The watcher held its position. We held the encounter for what I estimated at 10 minutes, longer than most of the previous encounters, before it moved away. I drove back to the district office and I filed it the same afternoon. Frost still on the ground the next morning when I checked the system. The 8th report was gone. But that afternoon I was back in the district on routine patrol, and I found something at the base of a hemlock tree in the section where the previous day's encounter had taken place. A stone. Roughly fist-sized, dark gray, and carved. Not roughly, not in the way that weather shapes stone over time. Deliberately carved with a pattern of lanes on its surface that were too regular and too consistent to be accidental. Something had made marks on that stone with an intention toward producing those specific marks. I picked it up and I turned it over in my hands for a long time. I am not a person given to projecting significance onto ambiguous objects. The Army cured me of that tendency fairly comprehensively. But I held that stone and looked at those carved lines and understood in the specific way that you understand things that have been building across a long period of time and have finally arrived at a point of clarity that the stone had been left for me to find. Not for anyone, for me. By something that knew this section of forest was my patrol section, and knew where I had been standing the previous day, and had placed something at that location between my departure and my return. I brought the stone home and put it on the kitchen windowsill. I filed the 8th report, which included a description of the stone and its carved lines. The 8th report was gone within 24 hours. But the stone was on the windowsill when I got home that evening, and it was still there this morning when I sat down to record this account. The air carries something specific in October in the Upper Peninsula that it does not carry in any other month. a clarity, the particular quality of light and cold, and the smell of leaf change in old growth forest that I had been breathing for 16 years and still found remarkable. I was on foot patrol in the hemlock stand where the 8th encounter had taken place, which had become a section I returned to more frequently than the patrol schedule strictly required, when the watcher appeared. Closer again. Another reduction in the established distance, this one more significant than the 8th encounter's 10 yards. The watcher was perhaps 25 yards from me, close enough that the detail I could see without optical equipment was substantially more than any previous encounter had provided. The fur in the afternoon light was not the featureless dark mass that distance had always produced. I could see the texture of it, the layering of a dense undercoat beneath longer outer fur that was adapted for the winter conditions of the Upper Peninsula, in a way that spoke of generations of existence in this specific climate. The face was fully visible, the long canine snout, the high-set ears. The eyes, in that afternoon light at that distance, were amber, a specific and clear amber that caught the low October sun in the hemlock stand and held it. We looked at each other for a long time, longer than any previous encounter. I did not count the minutes, and I did not look at my watch because looking at my watch would have required breaking eye contact, and breaking eye contact did not feel like the right thing to do. Then the watcher did something it had not done in 16 years of encounters. It took a step toward me. One step, deliberate and controlled, the way all its movements were deliberate and controlled. It stopped after that one step and held its position and looked at me, and I stood in the hemlock forest in the October afternoon and looked back at it with 16 years of encounters and 9 disappeared reports, and one carved stone on my kitchen windowsill between us. Then it opened its mouth, not in threat display, something quieter than that. And from somewhere in its chest it produced a sound that I want to tell you about as accurately as I can, because this is the part that required me to reorganize my understanding of the 16-year span in ways I am still working through. It was not a vocalization in the sense of the sounds I had been hearing from both creatures across 16 years of encounters. Not a call or a warning or any of the structured communications I had learned to distinguish between the watcher and the second creature across the years of observation. It was something that required my brain to process it twice before it could accept what it was hearing. Low and shaped wrong in the way a thing is shaped wrong when the mechanism producing it was not built for that purpose and is using that purpose only because the purpose is important enough to justify the difficulty. 2 words. Rough and slow and unmistakably language. Still watching. I stood in the October hemlock forest for a long time after it moved away. I drove back to the district office and I wrote the 9th report. I included everything. The reduced distance, the 1 step, the 2 words. I wrote all of it down in the same precise and honest language I had used for the previous 8 reports across 16 years. I submitted it the following morning. By Friday it was gone. Not archived, not transferred, not flagged for review. Gone from the system as if it had never existed. No audit trail, no record of submission or deletion. An empty space where a document had been 24 hours earlier. I went home, and I took the carved stone from the kitchen windowsill and I held it in my hand for a while. Then I put it back in its place, and I sat down at my kitchen table and I started writing this account. My wife deserves more space in this account than I have given her, and I want to correct that before I close. She knew about the encounters from the beginning. Not because I told her everything immediately, I did not, but because she reads what is happening in the people around her, with the accuracy of someone who has been paying very close attention for a long time. What was happening in me after the first encounter and the first disappeared report was visible to her before I had fully processed it myself. She asked me directly about 3 weeks after the first disappearance whether there was something I needed to tell her. I told her everything. She listened the way she always listens, which is completely and without the kind of reaction that would have made it harder to keep talking. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. The first was whether I thought I was in physical danger in the district. I told her honestly that I did not believe I was. The watcher's behavioral patterns across the encounters were consistent with assessment and observation rather than predation, and nothing in 16 years ever produced evidence that changed that assessment. The second question was whether I was going to keep filing the reports even though they kept disappearing. I told her yes. She said she understood why and that she supported it. She said the integrity of a record is the integrity of the person who keeps it, and that if I stopped keeping the record because someone kept removing it, the person who removed it would have won something that was mine to keep. She was right. She's been right about most of the important things across 31 years of marriage, and this was not an exception. The lockbox was her idea. The backup copies were her idea. The carved stone from the 9th encounter is on the windowsill in our kitchen, where we can both see it from the table where we drink our coffee in the mornings, and she has never once asked me to move it, or suggested that its presence there is anything other than what it is, which is evidence of something real that happened to her husband in a forest in northern Michigan, and that the official record was not permitted to acknowledge. I am grateful for all of it. People ask me whether the encounters were dangerous. I have been asked that more than any other question in the 14 months since I retired and started talking about this, and I want to answer it honestly here rather than leaving it implied. The honest answer is that across 16 years of encounters with the Watcher, I never had an experience that I assessed in the moment as a threat to my physical safety. The Watcher's behavioral patterns were consistent with observation rather than predation from the first encounter through the last. It maintained its distance. It did not display the approach behavior of a predator assessing prey. It did not react to my presence with aggression, or the kind of territorial display that large predators use when they feel their space has been invaded. It observed me the way I observed it. The assessment traveled in both directions, and neither assessment produced a threat response. The restless one is a different question, and I want to be honest about that difference. The restless one's behavior in the encounters where it was present produced threat assessment responses in me that the Watcher never did. Not because it displayed aggression directly, but because the quality of its physical presence carried a different kind of energy, less controlled, less patient, the energy of something that was operating at the edge of a restraint rather than comfortably within it. There were moments in the 7th encounter and the encounter I have not yet described in detail, the one that contributed to my decision to file a report that I knew would be pulled, where my Army-trained threat assessment was running on the restless one. In a way, it was not running on the Watcher. I believe the Watcher kept the restless one at a distance from me in several of the encounters, not through visible confrontation, not the way I saw it place itself between me and the restless one in the 7th encounter, but through a quality of presence and positioning that oriented the restless one's behavior in a particular direction. The Watcher knew I was in the district. It had assessed me across multiple encounters. It had made some determination about what I represented and what the appropriate relationship with me was. The restless one had not made that determination in the same way, or had made it differently, and the Watcher's consistent presence in the encounters was partly, I believe, a management of that difference. Whether that constitutes protection, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that across 16 years of encounters in the same district, the presence of the Watcher was always more reassuring than alarming, and that the presence of the restless one was always the reverse, and that I noticed in the later encounters that the Watcher seemed to account for both of those qualities simultaneously in the way it conducted itself in my presence. I retired 14 months ago. I handed in my badge and my equipment, and I walked out of the district office for the last time with 22 years of service behind me and 9 reports and a fireproof lockbox and a carved stone on my kitchen windowsill, and 2 words that I carry with me everywhere I go, because they belong to me now in a way that nothing filed in an official system and pulled the next day can belong to anyone. Still watching. I spent 16 years in the Upper Peninsula forests, documenting something that someone with the authority and the access to do so decided should not be documented. 9 times. Every single time. The reports gone within 24 hours with a consistency that required ongoing active monitoring of my filed work across the full 16-year span. Whoever was doing it never stopped. Never missed one. Never let a single report stand in the official record for longer than a day. I want to say something about that consistency from the other direction, from the watcher's direction rather than the department's, because the watcher was also consistent across 16 years. It appeared in my patrol district with a regularity that suggested the district was known territory, and I was a known presence within it. It maintained its behavioral patterns across the full span with the kind of consistency that belongs to something operating according to deeply held internal rules rather than reactive moment-by-moment decision-making. It reduced the distance between us across the later encounters in a way that felt deliberate and graduated, as if it was making a decision across years rather than in a single moment. And on the last encounter it took one step and said 2 words that I believe were said to me specifically, to the person who had been filing reports in this territory for 16 years, and watching and being watched in return. Still watching. 2 words that function simultaneously as a statement about the 16-year span of encounters and as a statement about what continues in those forests after my retirement. It was still watching when I was in the district, and it is still watching now that I am not. The forest does not stop being what it is because the officer assigned to it changes. Someone above me in the Michigan DNR spent 16 years making sure that what I observed in those forests would not enter the official record. I do not know if they knew exactly what they were suppressing, or if they were operating on institutional instructions that predated my assignment to the district. I do not know if the people who made those decisions understood the full scope of what lives in those Upper Peninsula forests, or if they were simply following a policy established by someone who did understand it and decided the official record was better without it. What I know is that the 9 reports are in the lockbox, that the carved stone is on my windowsill, that I spent 16 years in some of the most extraordinary forests in North America, in the company of something that assessed me and found me acceptable, and eventually, on the last October afternoon of my time in that district, took one step toward me and said 2 words in the cold, clear air of a hemlock forest that I will never adequately explain and will never stop being grateful for. Still watching. So am I, even from here, even retired, even now. I owed the truth of those 9 encounters to the record that someone else decided I was not allowed to create. This is that record. It exists now. Whatever system pulled those 9 reports in 24-hour intervals across 16 years cannot pull this one. That is why I am telling it. I want to say one more thing about the carved stone before I close this account, because the stone is the physical object that connects everything, and it deserves more than the brief mentions I have given it across the preceding pages. When I found it at the base of that hemlock tree the morning after the 8th encounter, I spent a long time on one knee in the forest, looking at it before I picked it up. The carved lines on its surface were not decorative in any way I could read as decorative. They were not random. They had a specific geometric quality, a series of intersecting curves and angles that held a relationship to each other, suggesting they were components of a unified pattern rather than independent marks. The quality of the carving itself, the consistency of the line depth and the precision of the curves, required the kind of tool control and patient attention that you associate with an intelligence that knows what it is making and is making it carefully. I have shown the stone to 3 people across the 14 months since I retired. My wife, who held it for a long time and said it was the most remarkable thing she had ever held in her hands. A retired professor of anthropology, whom I contacted through a chain of acquaintances, and who examined it for nearly an hour, and told me that the carving technique was unlike any documented lithic tradition in North America, while also being clearly intentional and skilled. And my grandson, who was 6 years old, and who held it for approximately 45 seconds before handing it back and saying it felt like it was thinking. I wrote that down when he said it. I am not sure a 6-year-old's perception is less valid than an anthropologist's in a situation like this one. He said it felt like it was thinking. I have held that stone in my hands hundreds of times across the past 14 months, and I have not arrived at a better description than that. The stone sits on the kitchen windowsill. It has sat there since the morning I brought it home from the forest. I look at it every morning when I drink my coffee at the kitchen table, and I think about the hemlock forest in October, and the amber eyes and the one step and the 2 words that were said in the cold, clear air of my last full year in the district. Still watching. The stone is real. The 9 reports are in the lockbox. The account you have just read is as accurate and complete as I can make it. Whatever system pulled those 9 reports in 24-hour intervals across 16 years cannot pull this one. That is why it exists. That is why I made it.